We have 13 participants and everybody's, oh, we're jumping up pretty big already. 22, 24. I get this pulled up on my phone really quick so I can make sure that we are broadcasting the correct screens at all times. And I'll get it to what, 12:02 and let everybody hop on because we only have like a third or a quarter of the initial registrants.
Okay.
Okay. All right. 40. There we go. All right. Hello, everyone. We're going to give it just one more minute. Mute my extra video so no one can hear it. There we go. We had over 100 people register for today, which is very exciting. So I just wanted to make sure everyone had a chance to hop on real quick. And hopefully the link works for everybody. If you can hear us or if you can't hear us, let me know in the chat box. That way we can make sure we fix this before we get started. All right, thank you, Sarah. All right, well, it's 12:02, so I don't want to hold us off anymore. I will go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Riley Price. For those of you who do not know me, I am the interim director here at Missouri Preservation. Missouri Preservation, if you are also not familiar with us, we are a 501c3 nonprofit statewide organization dedicated to advocating for, assisting with, and educating about historic preservation in Missouri for our resources and our architectural heritage. There we go. Words are hard. So I just wanted to say first today, because I know a lot of you want these educational opportunities throughout the year, and that's why we're offering this webinar today. We are looking at rescheduling our conference 2022 in Jefferson City. I hope to have that date out to all of you within the next 2 weeks. So be on the lookout for that. Really excited we can get everyone back together. So today we have for you, look up using facade assessments as a preservation tool. And we have Julia Manglitz doing this presentation today. I just want to say first off that there will be AIA credits available for this. And if you need those credits or need a certificate, please be sure to leave your information, AIA number, and if you need a certificate, either in the chat box, send me a message, send me an email, but just make sure you get that information to us within the end of the webinar today or shortly after the webinar, so we can get that involved. And without further ado, I will pass it off to Julia, and hopefully we will not have any technical difficulties. Yay.
Hopefully. So I see there's already one question in the Q&A. And yes, Riley is recording this. So if you signed up and attended, you should get a link if you have to leave us early, because I know this runs a little bit longer than most people's lunch hour. So as Riley said, this is, okay, make sure this is working. There we go. This is an AIA course, and it is 1.5 learning units for health, safety, welfare. Hopefully y'all read the course description. I won't read this. We are going to be talking about facade condition assessments and how they can be used as a preservation tool in particular. And there are several learning objectives. Mostly what I want you to be able to take away from this is a good idea about what a condition assessment is, how it might work as a preservation tool, and how you start to pull together a team or decide how to structure a condition assessment for a particular project, because projects are all different, just like our historic buildings are all different. Before I get started on the meat of the presentation, I did want to tell you a little bit about the company I work for, as well as myself. For those of you who don't know us or aren't familiar with us, Trainer HL is a company that we grew out of the merger of Trainer Architects, which some of you may be more familiar with, and H&L Architecture, which was based out of Denver. We merged several years ago. We currently have 10 offices in 9 different states. We are primarily an architecture firm, although we do have a little bit of in-house engineering. And our architecture is set up in studios. So we have different areas of practice focus that we work on. And I am part of the historic preservation studio. And we focus on historic, obviously, buildings, but we also do a lot of work with older buildings and existing buildings. And that may mean that we're collaborating with some of our other studios. For instance, if the company is working on a historic courthouse, you will typically see a team that is blended from folks from our preservation studio, as well as our justice studio, so that our clients are really getting the full benefit of our experience and knowledge base. Myself, I am an associate principal. I've been with the company for 19 years. Associate principal basically is one step underneath ownership, and it means that I'm responsible for a lot of things and have to pinch it for principals when they are overwhelmed with their workload. So I get to do a little bit of everything, including riding around in man baskets. I am skilled in most aspects of doing preservation work, but over the years, I have developed a special expertise in exteriors, particularly masonry exteriors, steep slope roofing, architectural sheet metal, windows, doors. You can get the idea. Most every project that I work on is for a public client. I do have a few private clients, but most of them are in a situation where they have to do a low bid if they're going to do repair work. And that's figures heavily into how I approach things. Most every one of my projects starts with a condition assessment. I've done 2 condition assessments in the last 4 days. So I spend a lot of time thinking about how we're going to do these for a project. If you have questions, go ahead and type them into the chat, but I'll save them to the end. There's enough technical stuff to manage while we're doing this, but it's easier if I don't deal with interruptions. So I'm going to start by defining a condition assessment, because I think this is a term we use, and it's good to just remind ourselves of what its intended purpose is. And this entire discussion today is focused on exterior assessments. So while some of the things I'm going to talk about apply to interior assessments, they don't all apply. An exterior assessment really is observation and recording of the materials and assemblies of a building, and documenting really the good, bad, and the ugly about those materials and assemblies. It may or may not be non-destructive. You may actually destroy a certain part of the building or disturb a certain part of the building. It may be a combination of them. It should involve historic research, so that you understand the changes over time in the development of the building, because that may impact and inform what you're seeing. It should include commentary about what's causing the conditions that are observed. And again, this is where that history component really starts to matter, because there are a lot of well-intentioned alterations and repairs that 10 or 20 years down the road lead to condition problems themselves. And it also should include recommendations, which may or may not include a cost estimate, depending on the detail level that's being requested. So when and why might you do a condition assessment? Well, it might be a legal requirement. Some cities, like New York City, down here in the lower right, actually mandate that facades, not just for historic buildings, but for all older and existing buildings, be inspected on a periodic basis. And there are a growing number of cities that are currently, I think, 13 adopted facade ordinances throughout North America. You tend to see this in cities that are dense, like New York, that have a high degree of older building stock and usually a fairly harsh climate that causes accelerated deterioration in some materials. And they're usually the result, unfortunately, of someone being killed by something falling off of a building. A lot of the newer model codes, though, do actually have a maintenance component, and some municipalities may be adopting certain portions of that or adopting slight variations on it. Those may also start to talk about whether or not a facade should be inspected. You may also see it as part of a due diligence report. So if a commercial property is up for sale, for instance, the lender may want to know that the owner understands, or their proposed owner understands what they're getting into. The bank may want to know what kind of risk is really involved in purchasing and redeveloping a property. So it's not uncommon on large purchases to see a lending institution ask for more information. And typically a condition assessment of the facade is part of that. You may also see it as part of an emergency response, such as the upper right, which is an earthquake in Napa, California. It may also be a man-made disaster, like a fire, or it could be that there's been a material failure and something has fallen off the building. Another reason that it might be required is that the owner, typically federal entities such as the National Park Service or the General Services Administration, if you're dealing with one of their historic properties, will require some sort of facade assessment before they do any work to the exterior. It may also come as a condition for funding. A lot of grants that pass through from the federal through our SHPO offices in the various states may also require that some sort of condition assessment or preservation plan or historic structure report be done as a condition of the funding. And historic structure reports and preservation plans may have an exterior facade assessment as one component of that work. As preservationists, we always love to see good news about historic buildings. And so what you're seeing up here is the kind of news we don't ever want to see our historic buildings make. We don't want them to be perceived as unsafe. We don't want them to seem scary and expensive to take care of. And I think most of us who've been in preservation for any period of time recognize that good, timely, appropriate maintenance is really the best preservation strategy there is. And facade ordinances are one component of trying to mandate good, timely, responsible ownership and maintenance of buildings. So as preservationists, we need to understand that there are some regulations that we could probably be advocating for that would help keep our historic and older buildings that maybe aren't listed yet well maintained. And I think it's a good idea to find out for your own education, you know, what's being asked of building owners in your particular municipality. And if you happen to know somebody who oversees part of the building inspections, you might be able to have a chat with them about whether or not they see the need for an ordinance like that. I think there are a lot of building officials who do think there is a need, but don't believe that there's the political will. And we as general members of the public can advocate for this. We can also advocate for it at the state and local government level. And this gets into funding our public buildings appropriately for their maintenance needs. If you are working with somebody who has a historic building and maybe they know it needs some work, but they don't know what to start with or how to start, a facade assessment is a good place to start. It's a very visible part of the building. It's generally the public face, and it is work that may help them prioritize and work out what needs to be tackled first on their particular building. Now, if you are working or living in an area that does not have an ordinance that provides some guidance, you can look at cities that maybe are similar to yours climatically, to see what their guidance is. Most of those facade ordinances are fully available online and for free. If bringing that to the table as an example is daunting, or you're afraid that it might scare a building owner that you're talking to or working with, there are other alternatives to that. ASTM has a number of standards that relate to the evaluation of facades. Most of them are geared toward finding unsafe conditions, but they do form a good basis for what you might look at and how frequently you might suggest looking at it, and what parts you need to actually get up on and look at closer. ASTM is the American Society of Testing and Materials, and those 4 little letters happen on just about everything that you touch or buy, whether you realize it or not. They regulate a lot of the work that's done in manufacturing as well as construction. And it is a set of consensus standards, and they are updated on a fairly regular basis. ASTM E2270 and E2841 really are intended to be used jointly. E2270 does provide recommendations for how frequently a facade should be inspected based on its age. And it provides some guidance for what you want to look at depending on how the facade is put together. TMS is the Masonry Society. They also have guidance for how to look at particularly masonry facades. The scope and detail of an assessment is something that needs to be discussed and decided upon. And there are a lot of factors that go into deciding what the right size is or what the right scope might be for a particular building. But one of the big questions to ask is what really is the intent? What purpose is that condition assessment going to serve? Is the building in such a state that everybody knows repairs need to be done, the owner's got financing ready to go, or is it more preliminary, trying to understand which parts of the building need attention first? Is there going to be a need for doing fundraising? And it may be several years before construction actually happens. Those kinds of questions affect the scope of the facade, the assessment. Critical information that the design team would need to know, or the person doing the assessment would need to know from the owner, is what kind of documentation is available. Do they have drawings of the building as it sits today? Or do they just have original drawings? Or do they have no drawings? Because that's frequently the case. Are there any previous reports that have been done? Or is there any documentation about previous repairs or alterations? Having that kind of information forms a basis for how much research and effort someone performing the assessment may have to put forth to get to the intended end product. And there are also factors just about the physical reality of the building that affect what the scope is and how the work of assessing it might be done. Age is a big part of it. What construction type is it? Is it a very complicated wall system? Say it's a newer building that has structure and maybe a multi-layered skin to it. How deteriorated is it? Buildings that are in a very serious state of deterioration are frequently harder to access and get around safely. If the site that they're on is very overgrown, it can make viewing it difficult and slow things down. The more deterioration you have, the longer it takes to document. It's also good to know where the building is headed, even if there's only a general sense. Maybe you have an owner who just wants to quote unquote save it and doesn't necessarily have an intended use yet. That frequently happens when we see preservation groups purchase a property to save it from demolition, but they ultimately are not going to be the ones that redevelop it and utilize it. Knowing what kind of alterations, as I mentioned, have happened is important. And the height of the building can really have an influence on how you structure the assessment and what tools you use and who needs to be on the team. You also need to know something about the interior. And I think this is the hardest part for a lot of people to wrap their heads around. You really can't dissect a building into its constituent components. A building is kind of an ecosystem in and of itself. And what happens inside is affected by the exterior. but the exterior is also affected by what happens on the inside. So understanding something about the state of the mechanical systems, what they are, how they operate, whether or not they're humidifying the building, for instance, is an important part of doing a condition assessment for the facades. Every project has a sweet spot where the more effort you put into the condition assessment, the more it's going to cost. And not every condition assessment requires the ultimate in cost and effort. It depends on where you're at and trying to put a project together, and it depends on the condition of the building. But in general, the more effort you put into the assessment, the more accurate any cost estimates are, the better the ability of the designers is to forecast unforeseens that might be happen upon during construction. The more you can plan for those, again, that increases the estimating accuracy, and it improves project schedules if you are going into construction, because anytime you hit an unforeseen condition, there is a hiccup, and it's a cost hiccup, but it's also a schedule hiccup. The more of that you can forecast and get your head wrapped around before you're in the fray of construction, the better. So a low cost condition assessment might be a visual only, and that might just be from the ground with binoculars, or it may employ some drones. Limited hands-on gives you that close range inspection, and that means that you are getting to the point where you can touch various components of the building. And this is frequently where ASTM lands kind of as a middle ground, where you're seeing all of the building, but you have some opportunity to get your hands on the building and at least perform some non-destructive evaluation. And I'll get into what that is. A comprehensive hands-on would mean that you're getting up close and personal with every component of the building. It's a fairly rare opportunity, to be honest with you, although it is one that definitely provides real beneficial information. Destructive investigations, which might include removing materials or creating openings in the facade that allow you to see hidden aspects of the construction, those are another item that is usually recommended in the ASTM standards, as well as in a lot of the ordinances, so that you're looking at things like concealed steel, which you typically have, say, in a terracotta facade. Material testing would be another step up. It's another investment in cost, but all of this can be seen as the more you know, the better you can plan the project, and the tighter your estimates can be, and the tighter your bid documents can be if you're producing construction documents, and if that's the intended outcome of a condition assessment. So let's talk for a little bit about the difference between assessment documents and contract documents, because they are not the same. And I frequently have owners who think that a condition assessment, they can just turn around and hand to a contractor and get their building fixed. And it's really not that straightforward. And there are reasons that it's not that straightforward. So this is what condition assessment documentation looks like. It's typically photographs and diagrams and a written report that talks about the conditions that are found and documents them. While it may be making recommendations about repairs, it may have multiple layers of recommendations that have different cost impacts and different outcomes. And those are the kinds of decisions that the owner typically needs to make, because they're the ones who are ultimately going to have to pay for it. And there are also typically recommendations that may involve further investigation that needs to happen. Sometimes in the process of answering one question, we come up with 2 or 3 more that are important to answer, because it may get to the feasibility of whether or not some of the repair recommendations can actually be implemented. Construction documents tend to look more like this. There are very defined, usually drafted details. There's usually some sort of written specification. And in this particular instance, there were excessive number of repair schedules. that this was a very large and very complicated project. But even on a smaller project, repair schedules can be helpful so that the contractors understand the quality and the quantity of the repairs that are going to be necessary to put the facade back together in an appropriate way, both from a performance standpoint and from a historic preservation standpoint. There's not typically a straight line between the assessment documents and the contract documents. What you're looking at here probably looks a lot like the contract documents, but this is actually an analysis that was being done for this particular building to determine what priority repairs were going to be. Just in case the bids came in high and the entire project as envisioned couldn't be afforded, this really was getting to the heart of what types of repairs need to be done, what type of repairs could be done if we can afford them, and how all of that impacts the structure of the contract documents and how they get bid. As I mentioned, sometimes recommendations in those condition assessments say, well, we could repair this one of two ways. This is an instance where we said that, but in order to decide if the less expensive way of doing it was feasible, we needed to do some testing because we were dealing with an archaic stone in this instance, and there was no good information about the physical properties of this stone, how anchors might respond, and we were also dealing with some pretty severe deterioration. So even if we had some information, we would have been looking for some reassurance that the repairs that we were talking about doing were technically feasible in the real world. So who should lead this condition assessment team, or who should be on it, and what do they bring to the team? I believe that architects should lead this. Architects are trained to look at buildings as entire systems and to understand how the different components of a building interact with each other. But we are almost never on that team alone. Engineers, structural engineers are kind of the obvious, especially if you're dealing with heavy materials like stone or materials that are supported by steel like terracotta. But sometimes the mechanical engineer is a good add to the team, particularly if you have a building that has a lot of moisture problems. They may be able to inform the team about aspects of the mechanical system that are impacting the facade. Specialist is kind of a broad umbrella. That might be anybody who, I don't know, flies a drone to a material testing agency that you can bring in to help with certain aspects of the building. Difficult access is typically a very specialized contractor. For instance, if you're working on a tower or a dome, in order to actually get up close on things, if you need to, you may need somebody who is trained to work off of industrial rope access. Very few people have that kind of specialization in-house. Contractors can provide a lot of support for condition assessments, whether it's lifts or scaffold like you see in the photograph, to get you to certain parts of the building. They also make inspection openings, and they can extract material samples and patch the building. If you're into working with a material that maybe is unusual or is somewhat out of your experience, bringing in somebody who is a materials conservator or a specialty contractor, for instance, who has decades of experience repairing certain material types or assembly types, they can be really informative and can really help sort out what's a feasible repair and what's not, what is beyond its useful life and will need to be replaced. Because the entire idea behind the condition assessment is to identify the causes and not just the symptoms. Your condition assessment will identify, yes, we have deteriorated stone here that's highlighted in blue, and we have losses highlighted in yellow, and cracks that have the red dashes on them. But you want to talk about what's causing it. Is it just normal wear and tear and weathering for that material? Or is there some other component about the building or the way it's been repaired in the past or alterations that have happened that are contributing to it? Is there something about the way it was originally designed and constructed that is exacerbating the deterioration? And is it something that can be corrected? And can it be corrected in a way that it doesn't cause future problems? That's a big thing to consider. And can it be done in a way that is in harmony with the historic character defining features of the facade? So you really want to understand what the original design intent, how was the structure meant to work? How were the materials meant to work? How was water supposed to be managed? What were the aesthetics? What was the performance intent? A lot of buildings we expect to perform in ways that they weren't necessarily designed to originally. Some of the tools for the investigation that you might use are, if you're just doing visual observation, binoculars, those are pretty easy ones, or scopes. Drones will definitely get you views that you can't get, particularly if it's a tall building that doesn't have taller buildings around it. And they can get in pretty close. But there are things that drones can't do. They can't do non-destructive evaluation. They can't put their hands on the building and tell an architect or an engineer something about the material. Is it wet? Is it delaminating? Is it detached? And that's when we get into things like non-destructive evaluation. And that might include an infrared scanning, or it might include sounding, which is an incredibly ancient way of looking at materials. And it's in that lowest picture there. Just tapping on materials with your hand on it can tell you a lot. It gives you sound feedback, and it gives you a sense of vibratory feedback, which can tell you about detachment that may not be visible, but is there. Ultrasound and ground penetrating radar, magnetometers, there are all kinds of things that you can use that are non-destructive. And then there's the whole world of investigative openings, which means you need to be up close again to be able to touch the building. Are you actually going to cut mortar out of the wall and send that off for material testing? Are you going to cut mortar and a few bricks out of the wall so that you can see what's happening behind that? Are you going to remove a window or some other piece of the facade so that you can understand better the condition of the anchorage and items that are concealed? Ideally, we would like, and preservationists should be advocating for, regular maintenance, which is that green zigzag line that you see at the top, where there is periodic financial investment in the building to keep it in good condition, where it's performing properly, you're not losing material. It needs to be appropriate maintenance for the type of materials it is, and it needs to happen at appropriate intervals. A lot of historic buildings that I deal with are down in that orange yellow line, where they get infusions of cash periodically, but their overall condition kind of continues to slide because no one can ever quite come up with enough money to bring it back up to where it really should be, or it's difficult. A lot of the things that we can do as preservationists to advocate for good maintenance, we should be doing. It's a matter of public health and safety. It's also a matter of just being good stewards of the investment that previous generations have passed on to us. That blue line is when nothing happens. And most buildings and most building materials, if nothing is done to maintain them, will not be with us in that 100 to 150 year range. There are exceptions on either side of that, but that's kind of the general idea. It really is in every owner's best interest, if they're going to own a building for any period of time, to be investing in routine and regular maintenance. I think we talk a lot in preservation about how new construction and new materials drives a lot of what we do. And I think we're starting to see that really reflected in the building stock that is owned in multiple decades, if not centuries. That 30-year depreciation that is typical of commercial properties and the tax write-off doesn't necessarily incentivize private owners to keep reinvesting in their buildings. And unfortunately, I think we're seeing that move into the world of public building ownership, which really is not in anyone's best interest. I'm going to run through a few case studies just so that you can kind of get an idea of the flavor, like who might be involved and the variety in condition assessments. not doing this to scare you off of them. If you haven't been involved in structuring one, try to find somebody who has to talk through. But I just want to give you an idea of the range of sizes and scopes and how these things come to happen and what the outcomes are. So this one was material deterioration. This was originally built as a train depot and later adaptively reused as a community center. It was in a prominent downtown location, very public building, and they had some really severe deterioration going on with the sandstone trim on this building. They had already identified transportation enhancement funds to help fund the construction, and the intent here was that we would move from the condition assessment into design documents for them. This is a building that did not have original documentation available. And it didn't have much documentation on the existing building, even from the 1980s adaptive reuse. There was information about the interior and how they changed the interior, but very little information about the exterior. And this is where having somebody on the condition assessment who is knowledgeable about historic construction and has resources, preferably from the period, to help understand how a building is more than likely put together is important. And we were able to do that here. Because of the level of deterioration, oh, by the way, this is after the repair. This is what everything looked like before the repair. Because we didn't have good, accurate drawings of the exterior, we did touch every piece of sandstone on this building, and this was done over the course of about 2 weeks to measure it so that we had a quantity of new sandstone that was going to be required. While we were not supposed to technically be looking at the brick and the stone meet each other, and they do have an impact on how the other one is behaving and performing. This is an area that we had cracks both inside and outside on the wall, and it had resisted previous attempts at repair. And there were at least 2 previous attempts from what we could tell, if not more. This is an area that after our initial condition assessment, we said, guess what? There needs to be a follow-up. This is one of those, we have some more questions here and we can't answer them by only looking at it and tapping on it. So this is an area that we recommended be opened up. It's above a skylight and adjacent to where we knew we were going to be doing a lot of replacement. So they did hire a mason and we went out. The initial group for this was just us, the structural engineer, and a general contractor who provided our lift access. This follow-up to that initial investigation involved a mason, same architect, same engineer, and it also involved testing. So that earlier slide that I showed you where we were doing anchor testing was done for this building. In the end, between the anchor testing and the follow-up investigation, that drove decisions about how much of this particular facade needed to be deconstructed and reconstructed, which ended up being basically from the arch up. And that had to do with the ultimate thinness of this gable end wall and the extent of the deterioration that we were seeing around the corners and our lack of ability to effectively brace anything for replacement. This is another study, and this one started off really interesting. This is a turn of the century building on a university campus. It is listed, and we were not in the lead. The MEP engineer was in the lead on this one because he was brought in for concerns about indoor air quality. And this really only affected the top floor of the building that you see here underneath that peaked roof and that sort of colonnade that's going off to the tower. And they really didn't want us to look at anything other than that floor. He walked into this space and said, I can do a whole lot of things with your mechanical systems, but it's not going to do much good because we're conditioning this entire end of campus because your envelope is so deteriorated and falling apart. So he recommended that we come in to help with that. And this is a cornucopia. This cornice that you see in the photograph really blocks the ability to view most of the lower third of this floor. And there are not enough adjacent buildings that are tall enough that you can see them. So the initial assessment team for this was the MEP engineer, ourselves, and again, a general contractor to provide the lift access to get us up to where we could actually see things and tap on them. Because of the level of deterioration, a visual only really wasn't going to get us what we needed. So drones were not a good fit for this. We have brick, we have stone, we have stucco, we have cast iron, we have sheet metal, we have copper, we have clay tile. Pretty much anything that you could think might be on the outside of a turn of the century building is on this floor. And then we also have replacement windows. They did have original drawings, and they did have some drawings of early interventions. There was a very large change done to the building fairly early in its life when it was structurally condemned for all intensive purposes, and the interior was gutted and completely replaced. It's not evident from the outside. All the color coding is for all of the different materials so that we could more easily sort through looking at each material as an individual. And it also had a really unusual wall construction that no one believed was probably accurate except me because the drawings were otherwise incredibly accurate, and I just figured it had to be. In this instance, the university provided inspection openings. Their maintenance folks cut some holes in the wall on the interior side that was easy for them to patch so that we could confirm that this is indeed how this wall is put together. And I mentioned that there was a big change to the building. This follow-up phase that we did, because this is another one that had a second phase to answer questions that were raised during the first phase, was really about the performance of the roof. The roof had been repaired multiple times. It was damaged by a microburst. And there was a lot of concern about whether or not it was still leaking or causing other problems. Because of the nature of the material and slopes and the exposure, this was not something we could get to with the lift. So we did bring in a specialty contractor, which is another role that contractors might play. It's a group that's very accustomed to dealing with clay tile and salvaging it for reinstallation. They had the equipment and the personnel to be able to get out and look at all of the facets of the roof, as well as open up some areas so that we could look at the substrate. And their report was very informative about how far we were going to need to go to make the roof behave the way the roof needed to, because the university also wanted to insulate it in a way that it was not currently. Now, I mentioned that there was a big change to the interior structure. At the same time, they made a big change to the roof. And this happened within the first 40 years of the building's life. There's a red X in the drawing on the right. That was historically an open light court on that uppermost floor that we were looking at. When they restructured the building, they closed that in, but they didn't change the roof drainage. And what that meant was they increased the amount of area, roof area, that 1 liter was draining. They took a gutter that was very shallow with 1 liter and more than doubled its served area. So it was draining 40% of the primary roof area for this building, and everything else was much more appropriately sized. What this had resulted in over the decades was deterioration, not just at that ledge, which was supposed to be, the bottom of our work, and all of the materials there, but that was extending down the full 4 stories and impacting the entry level as well and its little surround. So this was a very strong recommendation to really robustly deal with restructuring the roof drainage. This is another one that was a phase study. This was an emergency response to material failure. This is not really one building. It is more like 7 buildings that are conjoined. It is in part of a National Register landmark district, and it is the most visible contributor within that district. The initial team for this, we served as a consultant to another architect. There was a structural engineer involved, a crane operator so that we could get to this facade because this was crane basket access, and we had a mason as well as a testing agency. Because there had been a failure, and the failure happened right here to the left of the clock face, that piece of the cornice fell away and landed on a lower roof while that lower roof was being re-roofed. Really scared a lot of people, and subsequently folks went up and realized how much of the rest of the brick and stone up there was unstable. All of this had been parge coated and painted. And this particular building is my poster child for why visual only assessment really probably isn't enough for some buildings. This one had been subject to a visual only assessment a year or two prior to this failure as part of a historic structure report. And it really goes to show that there's a limit to what you can see. And even if they had gone up with a drone, which wasn't really a technology that was available at the time, I don't know that it would have prevented this from happening. The firm that did that visual assessment, somebody I know, respect, and I understand why the decision got made by the owner. But these are the kinds of failures that I use as examples when I'm talking to folks about the value of doing hands-on assessment. A hands-on assessment probably would have flagged a whole lot of these issues rather than waiting until it failed. This building was, or the tower, the clock tower, I should say, was sounded from top to bottom. At least the masonry components were. We really couldn't get close enough to the copper in the crane basket without damaging it to fully assess that, although we could get up into that part of the tower. We just couldn't get out into the lanterns that flank it. There were a lot of detailed notes made about where there was potential for more delaminations and where there were cracks. Buildings like this that have been coated are difficult to assess. They're difficult visually, but they're still difficult even with the hands-on because the coatings can conceal a lot of conditions, and there were multiple layers of coatings. This building, or the tower portion of it, was wet top to bottom. Every sample we extracted, both inside and outside, condensated as soon as it was put in a bag. And we did find some conditions that were concerning enough to go ahead and put a temporary stabilization on this northwest corner to buy time for construction documents to be done. The testing came back and told us that these were actually really good brick. They're just shy of being a severe weathering grade. They missed it by like point something on one test. So it really wasn't a material failure. This is very much a maintenance and an inappropriate previous treatment failure in this instance. To the credit of the ownership group and facility management group, they took a lesson from what happened with the tower and went ahead and picked up and eventually did a full condition assessment of the remainder of the structure. And this was done with the mindset of trying to make sure that there wasn't a similar failure setting up to happen elsewhere. The tower is not conditioned. The rest of the building does benefit from, being heated and cooled. So that assessment was, again, a full hands-on assessment, and you can see the move from hand drawing to digital documentation as part of the evolution of this. This was also accompanied by some trial repairs to see if the coatings could be removed without damaging the brick, which ultimately was not successful. And there was also some end-wall moisture monitoring done for a year to try to assess whether or not conditioning really was helping keep the walls drier, and it was. This was another emergency response, but this was a natural emergency response. This was a bell tower that was struck by lightning. When we were called in, the owner already had a mason on board who was doing repairs, but the mason had kind of let the owner know that they felt like there was going to be an issue with the insurance company over this because they couldn't just put the stones back in place that had fallen. And so we were brought in and were able to help explain to the insurance company why it wasn't going to be as simple as just popping a couple of stones back in the wall. This is a very short, relatively simple project, but it really helped the owner get what they needed from the insurance company and help the masons sleep at night over the repairs that they were being asked to do. We did look at a few other aspects of the tower and made a few other recommendations since we were already up there in the lift, just so that they're aware of, that they need to do some work up here. This is another one that for a client that was very short. This was, again, just really a 2-day study. It started off because the owner, which is a nonprofit, had just finished window restoration on the building, and they wanted to finish sprucing up the exterior, and they were thinking they wanted to clean the masonry. This is another National Register building. It is a landmark in downtown, and it is right on the sidewalks, and it's a South End anchor. It's fairly prominent facade on all sides, but it is very tall and it is difficult to see portions of it from below. No original drawings, but they did have Habs era drawings. This is a mix of brick, stone, and terracotta. So a couple kinds of stone, actually. We went up with the intent of documenting and getting a closer look at some of the staining, especially the vertical streaking that you see, and that was evident even in the historic photos. But one of the things we realized pretty quickly when we got up there was that they had a lot of open joints and things that would not respond well to having water washing all over them as part of a cleaning process. And so we knew that there would need to be some masonry repairs. When we got up higher, though, we started to see a lot of shingles in the gutters. And then we really pushed the limits of what the lift had height-wise and started to realize that there were a lot of loose slates that were going to continue to find their way down there. So when we came down, we talked to the owner about it and said, we understand you'd like to clean the facade and there's this one area you need to fix now. But if you don't have a lot of funding, we really think you need to put it into fixing your roof and getting some repairs done to the gutters, because the slate had damaged the gutters in a few places where it landed. And ultimately that was what they decided to do. And it was a much better use of their limited funds. So in this instance, masonry wasn't the priority. And this is the other thing that condition assessments can help owners understand, especially owners that are balancing the need to spend money in lots of different areas for their building. This is the last case study, and this one is a really unusual one. This was visual only, and it was intended to help a campus start putting their buildings in some sort of priority order. They came up with 73 buildings that had some component of stone facade, and the ages ranged from 1876 to 2017. Some of these are National Register, some of them are National Register eligible, and some of them probably will be in the next 10 years. Like most public institutions, they are facing an enormous deferred maintenance backlog, but they had life safety and water infiltration concerns. And they wanted to make sure that they were addressing the life safety concerns and not missing something because there are so many buildings. We divided the 73 buildings on their list into 3 phases. And over the course of a couple months last summer, looked at 60 of those buildings. The initial assessments were done quickly. And they were done with the mind that we would score these buildings. So we have everything from the tall to the small and the rambling. Some of them are really concealed by trees, and you can see there's a lot of different ages and a lot of different limestones and limestone combinations going on. We knew that we would be doing follow-up studies on this, and the information was collected and set up into a scoring system so that we could start sorting out which buildings need to be looked at in more detail first, and what sort of mitigating measures might need to be put in if they don't have the funding to fix these areas or address them right away. We structured this information gathering so that we could actually sort buildings by score and by age. That was interesting. A lot of people assumed going into it that the oldest buildings were going to be the biggest problem, We actually found that a lot of the 40 to 60-year-old buildings are also starting to present some fairly significant issues and problems. And that was information that they needed to know to be able to start planning before their deferred maintenance backlog gets even bigger. We also collected this information in a way that we could start to look at where the conditions occur. Is it the east, south, west, or north facade? Is there an exposure on this campus that is worse than others? Are there certain elements of the building that are more contributing than others to any of the facade conditions? So for instance, roof typically meant parapet or something that was immediately adjacent to the roof or being impacted by roof drainage. So we collected this in a lot of ways to be able to garner and analyze some of the information to help them start thinking about ways to manage that backlog. And we are currently working on follow-up assessments. So as a preservationist, if you're working with somebody who is new to dealing with historic buildings or somebody who isn't sure how to deal with theirs, condition assessments really are value added. It can help define scope, create priorities. It can help manage cost for construction and budgets, and it can help manage unforeseen conditions. And as preservationists, when we talk about maintenance ordinances or facade inspection, I think it's good for us to note that it's not just for historic buildings, that's for any older building, really. And that it's about good maintenance. It's about public safety. It's about maintaining the investment that we have in our built environment and our cultural assets. And it also means that there might be more buildings available to us for listing as they start to age into that 50-year mark that we start to say, hey, that might be eligible for the National Register. They are valuable. They are incredibly variable, like historic structure reports and preservation plans. They can be customized to the intent and to the budget that an owner has. And they do typically take some back and forth and discussion about what's appropriate to include and what's not, and what might be planned to be tackled later. But they are a worthwhile planning document. And with that, I will start looking at the Q&A. Or are people typing into the chat or the Q&A?
A little bit of both, it looks like.
Okay. Let's see. Somebody asked, where is this building located?
That was the first of your case studies, I believe.
The first of my case studies.
The riverfront. Oops. The riverfront building.
Yeah, so that was Riverfront Community Center. This is located in Leavenworth, Kansas. And that one, the final phase of the masonry restoration finished that one up. Somebody, can you give us examples of cities with facade regulation standards? So yes, there are, like I said, there are 13, and Chicago and New York are probably the two, biggest ones. San Francisco's is relatively new. I think St. Louis has a baby ordinance. Boston has one. I can follow up with you and get you the list. But not as many as probably should. I'm located closest to Kansas City, and I know there's been a lot of discussion for a long time about the need for one in Kansas City. It often is a matter of political will and lack thereof, and or real estate and private owners being a stronger voice or more influential, unfortunately, than those who are advocating for public safety. What's the proposed energy efficiency requirements? So if you're looking at doing major installation or energy upgrade to a building to try to get better performance, I think you absolutely need to do a condition assessment. Because if you have a whole lot of open joints and stuff, you're not going to get the performance that you think you're going to get. And in that instance, the condition assessment needs to be paired with a pretty intense look at how the envelope's going to behave under different insulation scenarios. On historic buildings, typically the insulation is going to have to be added to the inside to prevent changes to the exterior that would not pass review. That can be problematic depending on how you're looking at doing it. And it is not a one size fits all. You really do, in that instance, need to involve a mechanical engineer, in my opinion. You might want to involve somebody who does energy modeling, but honestly, if you're on a budget, just doing a steady state analysis of different wall assemblies and roof assemblies, don't leave the roof out of that equation, can be really informative about strategies that are going to be dangerous. And that is something that we typically do. And there is a lot of debate right now about whether or not adding insulation to mass walls accelerates deterioration of the exterior or not. And there are a lot of people who are looking at that from different directions. So it's an area we need to learn more. Simeon, hi, Simeon. How do you work with crafts-based businesses, contractors, and when do you bring them into the conversation and process? When I need access, I prefer that the mason provide access rather than a general contractor, because then I've got somebody right there at my elbow that I can say, what do you think about this? Because they do typically bring a different perspective. And I really believe that condition assessments and treatment for historic buildings is better when we have more minds at the table who are looking at it from different aspects. There are times that I will look at something and the tradesperson standing next to me will say, oh, well, they did that because of this. And it wouldn't necessarily occur to me because I don't do the work that they do. And sometimes I have an answer that wouldn't have occurred to them because they don't do the work that I do. When we're dealing with specialty materials, for instance, I'm dealing with Adobe buildings right now on some of my projects. We have someone who has, worked on Adobe buildings for probably as long as I've been alive. And I learned something from him every time we talk. So having somebody who is intimate with materials in a way that architects and engineers are not, to me, is essential in helping make decisions about where we take samples, what kind of samples we take, what questions we might want to answer as part of our condition assessment. So if I know I'm going to be able to incorporate them in our assessment team, I'm talking to them the same time I'm talking to the owner about how we're going to structure their assessment. I hope that answers your question, Sylvia.
There was a comment earlier in the webinar. What is the range of cost for the minimum to full assessments?
Wow. That is really hard to answer. For a small building that's in relatively good condition, you might be talking about a few thousand. If you're talking about needing access and testing and contracting, you're going to get up into the tens of thousands pretty quickly. And it really is driven by, how big the building is too. I've done one full hands-on assessment for state capital, and that project, actual time in the field just to touch and document all of those stones was probably close to a year and a half. And we were maybe 2 years. It's been a while since I looked at the timeline for that, but it can be a very lengthy process depending on how you've structured it. Are there any other questions? We have time. I see that Yarek, thank you, Yarek. put answers to someone's question about which cities. You'll notice that most of them, so he's got Boston, Chicago, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Columbus, Detroit, Milwaukee, New York City, Philly, Pittsburgh, San Francisco, St. Louis, and I will add Quebec in Canada to that as well. A little surprised Toronto doesn't have one. What you're going to see there is they're mostly coastal cities or Rust Belt cities, or cities that, like I said, have some aspect that are going to be a more severe weathering and older building stock. But as our building stock in other areas ages, we're going to see more and more need for them in other ways. So someone's saying adding insulation only is widely recognized as a major fail. I think it depends on who you talk to. Adding wall insulation, I think, is not the return on investment that adding roof insulation is. But anytime you're changing the thermal performance and where the dew point happens on an exterior assembly, you need to understand what you're doing. And that's more pressing, I think, the further north you get. But there are challenges with working in the South as well. Somebody says, were you involved in assessment of the Missouri State Capitol? Very early on, yes. We were not involved in the most recent project, but we were involved in the assessment work that led to the project that just completed.
Yark also added, what are your thoughts on recommendations to repair historic facades with modern materials using fiberglass moldings to replicate cornices or decorative features?
Excellent question, Yarek. Anytime you're dealing with substitute materials, I think you really need to look at first how it's going to be attached. Second, you need to think about how it is going to behave differently from everything else around it. So if you're only replacing certain portions of a cornice and not all of it, the portions you replace are not going to behave thermally the same as the material around them because they're now a different material. And thinking about how you deal not just with sealing it, sealing those joints when it goes in, but the life of those joints and what's going to be necessary 5 years or 10 years down the road to make sure that it doesn't become another unsafe condition, I think is something that requires consideration. I don't think that there is one set right answer for every particular instance. There's not, there's good and bad in everything. For instance, there are a lot of materials that are not my first choice to use because I worry about the compatibility over time or the reversibility of them. For instance, silicone, as mundane as sealant. I prefer not to use silicone because once you go there, you can't come back and reseal with anything else. But that only applies to porous substrates. You'll never get the silicone back out of brick or any kind of natural stone, at least not with the kind of chemicals we have today. 20 years from now, somebody may have a silver bullet for it. But right now, I don't consider that a reversible treatment. So it's one where I tend to use polyurethanes, unless someone else has already used silicone, in which case we're married to it. It's really about understanding the materials that you're using, the assemblies that you're using them in, the desired performance, and making sure that the owner who's paying for the work understands the implications of the decisions that are being made. We're making this decision now because it's a cost decision. What is that going to mean to you in 5, 10, 15, 20 years? I think we as preservationists are in a unique place to be able to help people think longer term about their buildings. And I think that's something that we can add to the conversation, not just on existing buildings, but new ones as well. Someone else asked, how has the age of preservation professionals changed over time? Is there interest from a younger generation? I think there are younger generations who are interested in it. I see a growth in the number of preservation programs at universities. I wish I saw as much growth in trades training, so not just the design side, but also the actually getting it built side, which is in some ways, in my mind, almost more important than the design side. If I can draw anything, we just have to find somebody who can build it. And then there was extension of your comment, materials, lime versus Portland mortars. Okay, well, here's the thing. Portland cement of today is not the Portland cement of 1970 or 1950 or 1930 or 1910. That is a material that continues to evolve and change. Frankly, so does lime. We are also now getting into the point where there are a lot of buildings that were built with Portland cement that are historic. So I think as preservationists, we need to start being aware of how the materials that we deal with have changed. I have long been an advocate now that we need to look at the tables in ASTM C270 and try to update them, because I can tell you most mortars mixed by those proportions well exceed anything that's a minimum in those tables. And based on the bit of research I've been able to do, I think the tests that probably established the minimums in the C270 tables, which is the mortar mix tables for those who aren't familiar with it, I think that those tests probably date back to the 20s or 30s. So I think it's a gross underestimation of when you go buy a bag of type N, what you're actually getting these days. And for those of us who are concerned with the maximums as well as the minimums, and we are in preservation, I think it's a really important point to have in our minds and to start educating contractors about, owners about. It's a conversation that I have pretty frequently.
Any more questions? Oh, we got another one. If you're okay with
Okay.
it. I had this scheduled till 1:30.
Yeah.
So if we had anything else, throw them out.
Yeah. Well, you got to get people their money's worth here, or their registration's worth. Are you getting more into the conversation concerning saving historic building as a sustainable method of materials instead of tearing them down and rebuilding to make more carbon? Gosh, how long ago was this? In the early mid 2000s, was involved in probably one of the first LEED certified historic preservation projects, certainly the first in Kansas. And that saved the world a whole lot of carbon pain. I do not believe that sustainability and historic preservation are incompatible. I think they are two sides of the same coin. I think there are a lot of people in the design and construction world that do not understand that on a really fundamental level. Not only do I advocate for saving buildings because I think it's environmentally responsible, I think it's fiscally responsible. I think it's a responsible way to deal with the taxes and the just the strain on our infrastructure. We have a lot of places whose older infrastructure, from sewers to sanitary lines to roads, are degrading. The more we can incentivize reinvestment in what we already have and good maintenance of what we already have, that ultimately, to me, fulfills environmental goals. It fulfills cultural goals. It fulfills historic goals. It fulfills goals of creating jobs, because it's very hard to outsource the physical labor that it takes to repair a place. And I'll take it one step further. Again, this is where, to me, preservation has, folks in preservation can start demonstrating our values and explain to people what we have to bring to the table that informs new construction. When I talk to the folks in our other studios who are doing new builds, I'm always advocating that they use stone rather than tilt-up concrete, for instance, because the carbon footprint of stone is smaller than concrete right now. And I'm usually advocating that they try to find a local stone and advocating that it be a traditional veneer because that is more repairable and more durable than the sort of, I'm going to say, lick and stick kind of stone that's out there right now. And I think that that is something else that we as preservationists need to start bringing to the larger AEC world and having conversations about, okay, if you want to talk about sustainability and durability, let's talk about those things really in a robust way and question whether or not some of the things that are considered green really are, because some of them aren't. And I think that we have unique insights that we can bring to that conversation. And I think we should. And we should do that, not just within the industry, but also with politicians and folks who help make the rules.
And just to add to that, I would say for those of you who don't follow along with the National Trust, they are working currently on a national impact agenda. And part of that is bringing in and making folks more aware of the environmental impacts and the positives of historic preservation, as well as going back to an earlier question, getting younger folks involved in preservation and making sure that trade skills, especially historic trade skills, of course, are being passed on to individuals so we can make preservation more equitable, more available all across the board.
Absolutely. Let's see.
Done with that.
Yay, I'm glad to hear that they're retrofitting in Hamilton. I've been to Toronto a few times lately, and last time I went, I stayed in an Airbnb in a historic district and walked around and was kind of dismayed at some of the things that were happening to some of the older buildings. A little sad. Do I have actual hard numbers on carbon cost and body density? I do not. I just know that there's a whole lot more energy that goes into quarrying stone, burning it to make the constituent parts of concrete, and then rehydrating it in the heat that it puts off. So just doing the energy calculations on it, there's a lot more processes involved in creating something like concrete or brick. They are doing a better job of trying to be energy conscious with it. But I would love to have the free time to actually do some studies or find somebody who's done them. It is something that I've heard talked about in a number of circles where people are drilling down on what it means to be green and what the carbon footprint of different materials are. And there's some really exciting new carbon calculators that are coming out. I just have not personally had a chance to play with any of them yet to see, what they're based on and what comes out of them.
I think that's about it for our questions. Once again, if you needed AIA credits for today, or if you just needed a certificate, if you're not an AIA member, but you need a certificate to show that you did some continuing education, please be sure to drop us a comment with your AIA number, your email, or if you need that certificate. Also, I would definitely love to thank Julia. Thank you so much for doing this presentation for us today. And thank you to Trainer HL for providing these AIA credits for us. This was an absolutely wonderful presentation. And I know this has been a hot topic that folks ask Missouri Preservation about all the time. So it's great that we finally have some answers. And this was recorded and it will be made available to all of you. You will receive an email with a follow-up after today.
Happy to be a resource. And I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon, wherever you are in the world.
I was gonna say we had a wide audience today. It's exciting. And I'll leave this on just a minute more if you guys need to drop anything in the comments to let us know. If there's no more AI, oh, I got one more, but if you have any other need for AIA, just send me an email, admin@preservemo.org. Thanks, everybody.